that brewing is a thing from which the public must be protected. This is simply not true.
So other families will not have the experience and the pain and trauma that they had to live through.
For too long, states like New York told millions of citizens that their right to armed self-defense ended the moment they left their homes.
She proves you can run for office ending gun violence in the South and you can win.
Lawful gun owners are not the driving force behind criminal gun violence, and this is particularly true of concealed carry permit holders.
Breaking news, the Supreme Court has championed suppressor freedom, removing NFA restrictions. A monumental victory for gun rights advocates as the law triumphs in the battle for Second Amendment protection. Texas suppressor freedom. In this video, we delve into the Texas suppressor freedom case, which seeks to challenge the National Firearms Act and the Arms Export Control Act regulations on suppressors. This legal battle is crucial for Second Amendment advocates who believe that these regulations infringe upon their rights to own and use suppressors. The case under discussion is named Paxton v. Detolf-Box, representing a significant legal effort to challenge suppressor regulations in Texas. The plaintiff, Attorney General Ken Paxton, aims to eliminate or weaken the NFA and AECA regulations specifically concerning suppressors, making it easier for law-abiding citizens to own and use them without excessive restrictions. The NFA, enacted in 1934, imposes strict regulations on certain firearms and accessories, including suppressors. It requires individuals to pay a tax, undergo background checks, and obtain approval from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives before owning a suppressor. The AECA complements the NFA by controlling the export of defense articles, including suppressors. Advocates of the Texas suppressor freedom case argue that these regulations infringe on the Second Amendment rights of Americans. They believe that suppressors are essential safety tools that protect hearing and prevent noise pollution during shooting activities. They argue that the regulations disproportionately burden law-abiding citizens without deterring criminals. The outcome of this case is critical, as it could set a precedent for the future of suppressor regulations in Texas and potentially nationwide. If successful, it may pave the way for other states to challenge and reform existing suppressor regulations, making it easier for responsible gun owners to access these devices without excessive bureaucracy. However, it's important to note that this legal battle is likely to face strong opposition from gun control advocates who argue that easing suppressor regulations could compromise public safety and make it easier for criminals to acquire and use these devices. As the Texas suppressor freedom case unfolds, Second Amendment advocates and gun control proponents will closely monitor the developments. The outcome of this legal challenge could have a lasting impact on the rights of gun owners and the regulations surrounding suppressors across the U.S. Texas Suppressors Challenge. The Texas suppressor freedom case revolves around an essential legal battle challenging the regulations imposed by the National Firearms Act and the Arms Export Control Act on suppressors within Texas. The case, named Paxton v. Detolf-Box, seeks to eliminate these regulations, making it easier for Texas residents to own and use suppressors without undue federal restrictions. The case recently had oral arguments on cross motions for summary judgment, where both sides presented their arguments before the court. The preliminary indications from those hearings suggested that the pro-Second Amendment side faced challenges in their efforts to eliminate the suppressor regulations. However, the state of Texas took a proactive approach and asked the judge for the opportunity to submit additional materials and support for their motion for summary judgment. The court granted their request, allowing Texas to address the judge's main questions during the hearings through a letter. The focus of the case lies in Texas House Bill 957, which aimed to exempt suppressors made and retained within the state from federal regulation. The argument behind this law is that since these suppressors are exclusively made and sold within Texas and don't involve interstate commerce, they should fall outside the scope of federal regulation enforced by the ATF. Despite the passage of HB 957, the ATF responded with a letter indicating their intention to continue enforcing NFA restrictions on suppressors made in Texas. This led to further complications as the ATF asserted their authority to enforce the federal law against individuals who manufactured or sold these items, challenging the state's efforts to exempt Texas-made suppressors from federal oversight. The case carries significant implications for Second Amendment rights in Texas and beyond. The outcome will determine whether Texas residents can enjoy easier access to suppressors, without having to navigate the cumbersome federal regulatory process imposed by the NFA and AECA. By seeking additional evidence and submitting a letter addressing the judge's concerns, Texas has presented a compelling case in defense of their state law. This legal maneuver provides an opportunity for the pro-Second Amendment side to bolster their arguments and strengthen their position against the ATF's enforcement of federal restrictions on suppressors made in Texas. As the case progresses, Second Amendment advocates, gun rights activists, and legal experts will closely monitor the developments. The court's final ruling could significantly impact suppressor regulations in Texas and potentially set a precedent for other states aiming to challenge federal firearm restrictions within their borders. Texas ATF lawsuit. A lawsuit filed by the state of Texas against the ATF regarding suppressor regulations. The case recently had a hearing in a federal district court. The state of Texas argues that the federal regulation of suppressors made and retained within the state is not permitted, as it does not involve interstate commerce. They further contend that the ATF's regulations significantly impact Second Amendment rights and impose an impermissible tax on this constitutionally protected right. In the original complaint, Texas asserted that suppressors made and sold exclusively within the state do not fall under the scope of federal regulation, as they do not cross state lines. The state's argument is rooted in the idea that the regulation of items solely within the state should be the responsibility of state authorities rather than federal agencies. They claim that the ATF's regulation of these items infringes upon the Second Amendment rights of Texas residents, as it imposes unnecessary restrictions on their ability to exercise their right to bear arms. Texas argues that the ATF's regulation imposes an impermissible tax on the Second Amendment right to own and use suppressors. The idea is that requiring individuals to pay fees and undergo background checks to own suppressors places an undue burden on exercising this constitutional right. The state's arguments were further bolstered by a recent Supreme Court decision in the case of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. The decision clarified that the appropriate analysis for evaluating Second Amendment restrictions should be based on the text's historical understanding. This means that the ATF is now required to justify their regulations on suppressors made in Texas, as well as other types of restrictions, using this analysis set forth in the Bruin decision. Throughout the case, the ATF has attempted to avoid this burden by arguing that the Second Amendment is not implicated at all in their regulations. This stance seeks to downplay the impact of their restrictions on individual Second Amendment rights, and in turn, avoid having to justify their regulations using the Bruin analysis. The outcome of this lawsuit has significant implications for Second Amendment rights in Texas and potentially nationwide. It will determine the extent of federal regulatory authority over suppressors made and sold exclusively within the state, and could set a precedent for future challenges to federal firearm regulations. As the case progresses, it will be closely watched by both gun rights advocates and gun control proponents, as its outcome will shape the landscape of gun rights and regulations in the U.S. Constitutional inconsistency. This centers around a contradiction in the ATF's stance regarding suppressors and their Second Amendment protection. On one hand, the ATF argues that suppressors are not bearable arms and therefore not protected by the Second Amendment. They claim that this interpretation allows them to impose any regulation they desire whenever it suits their convenience. However, when it comes time for the ATF to actually regulate these items, they classify suppressors as firearms, indicating they should fall under the Second Amendment's protection. The crux of the issue lies in the ATF's inconsistency in defining suppressors. By claiming that suppressors are not bearable arms, the ATF seeks to distance these items from Second Amendment protection, arguing that they do not fall within the scope of constitutional rights. This interpretation potentially allows the ATF to impose stricter regulations on suppressors without facing constitutional challenges. However, the inconsistency arises when the ATF classifies suppressors as firearms in their statutory definition. Firearms, by definition, are arms protected under the Second Amendment. This classification undermines the ATF's previous claim that suppressors are not covered by the Second Amendment. This contradiction leads to confusion and raises questions about the ATF's motivations and intentions when it comes to regulating suppressors. Critics argue that the ATF's shifting definitions indicate a selective approach to interpreting the Second Amendment, raising concerns about potential misuses of regulatory power. The inconsistency also creates legal complexities and challenges when it comes to court cases involving suppressor regulations. The ATF's conflicting stances make it challenging for courts to determine the appropriate level of scrutiny and constitutional protection for suppressors. The issue has broader implications for gun rights and regulations. As the debate over Second Amendment rights continues, clarifying the classification of suppressors becomes critical to establishing consistent and fair regulations. This inconsistency in the ATF's approach highlights the need for clearer guidelines and a more coherent interpretation of the Second Amendment in the context of firearms and accessories. Overall, the ATF's conflicting stances on suppressors raise concerns about their regulatory practices and interpretation of the Second Amendment. The debate over whether suppressors qualify as bearable arms with Second Amendment protection remains a contentious issue. Resolving this inconsistency is crucial for establishing a consistent and fair framework for firearm regulations and protecting the constitutional rights of gun owners. Second Amendment arms dispute. A legal dispute centered around the classification of certain items as firearms under the Second Amendment. The case is currently at the stage of cross motions for summary judgment, where both Texas and the ATF have filed motions seeking a resolution without a full trial. In essence, a summary judgment motion aims to decide the case swiftly based on existing evidence and arguments. At the core of the case is the definition of arms protected under the Second Amendment. Texas contends that the Second Amendment safeguards not just firearms, but all types of arms that can be used for self-defense. They argue that the Second Amendment's protection extends beyond traditional firearms to encompass a broader range of self-defense tools, including the items in question. On the other hand, the ATF takes a more restrictive view, asserting that only actual firearms, in the traditional sense, should be protected under the Second Amendment. According to their position, the Second Amendment scope should not encompass a wide variety of arms beyond conventional firearms. The judge's decision in the cross motions for summary judgment will be critical in determining the constitutional protection afforded to these specific items. If the judge rules in favor of Texas, it could potentially set a precedent for extending Second Amendment protection to a broader array of self-defense tools beyond conventional firearms. Another significant aspect of the dispute is the ATF's position that the items in question are dangerous and unusual. This classification can be used to justify imposing stricter regulations on such items. Texas contests this characterization, arguing that the ATF's assertion is not accurate. They aim to debunk the motion that these items are inherently dangerous or uncommon, thereby challenging the basis for stricter regulations. The case's outcome holds substantial implications for gun rights and regulations. It has the potential to shape the interpretation of the Second Amendment regarding the protection of different types of arms used for self-defense. Depending on the judge's ruling, it could impact the legal status and regulations surrounding various self-defense tools beyond traditional firearms. In decision, the case is a pivotal legal dispute concerning the scope of Second Amendment protection for different types of arms. The cross motions for summary judgment offer both sides the opportunity to present their arguments without the need for a full trial. The decision in this case could have lasting ramifications for gun rights and the regulation of self-defense tools under the Second Amendment. Texas challenges ATF suppressors. In the legal battle over suppressor regulations, Texas strategically cited statements made by ATF leadership during the Obama administration, where suppressors were deemed non-dangerous. Additionally, ATF's own data revealed that a substantial 2.6 million suppressors were legally registered in the U.S., debunking any claim that suppressors are unusual. Armed with solid facts and a recent supportive Supreme Court decision, Texas appeared to have the upper hand in their case against ATF's regulations. However, reports from the hearing indicated that Texas attorneys might have stumbled on some arguments before the judge, potentially weakening their position. Nonetheless, the situation took a positive turn when Texas submitted an additional letter and arguments to the court, which the court readily agreed to consider. This move proved crucial in remedying any shortcomings and bolstering Texas's case. The letter addressed three key questions raised during the hearing, starting with the issue of standing. Texas argued that they have standing under the Supreme Court's recent Axon ruling. This means that plaintiffs should be allowed to bring constitutional challenges to the federal government's regulation of suppressors without subjecting themselves to potentially unconstitutional procedures. By citing the Axon ruling, Texas aimed to establish that they have the right to challenge the ATF's regulations on suppressors, making their case stronger and more compelling. This strategic move ensures that the court recognizes their legitimate standing and that their arguments hold weight in the eyes of the law. Furthermore, Texas's letter delves into the Second Amendment's protection of suppressors. They assert that the Second Amendment safeguards not only conventional firearms, but also a broader range of arms used for self-defense, including suppressors. This argument directly challenges the ATF's restrictive view that suppressors are not protected under the Second Amendment, further bolstering Texas's position. Overall, Texas's well-researched letter and additional arguments signify a dynamic and tenacious approach to their case. While they may have faced challenges during the initial hearing, they quickly remedied any weaknesses and presented a compelling case supported by factual evidence, recent Supreme Court rulings, and a clear understanding of the Second Amendment's scope. As the legal battle continues, the court's decision will have significant implications for gun owners and the regulation of suppressors. It will determine whether suppressors indeed enjoy constitutional protection under the Second Amendment, and whether ATF regulations on these items withstand scrutiny. In supposition, the clash between Texas and the ATF over suppressor regulations becomes a captivating legal saga filled with twists and strategic maneuvers. Texas's ability to remedy any setbacks and present a compelling argument in their letter showcases their determination to challenge the ATF's regulations. The outcome of this case could be a game-changer for gun rights, setting a precedent for the future interpretation of the Second Amendment's protection of various arms, including suppressors. ATF suppressor lawsuit analysis. The crux of this legal dispute lies in the arguments made by the ATF in their opposition to the lawsuit filed against them. The ATF has repeatedly contended that the plaintiffs lack standing to bring this lawsuit because none of them have submitted made-in-Texas suppressors to the ATF for National Firearms Act approval. The ATF insists that standing will only be established if individual plaintiffs submit these suppressors for registration and subsequently face denial by the ATF. However, Texas challenges the ATF stance by invoking a recent Supreme Court ruling. According to this ruling, the plaintiffs are not required to subject themselves to an allegedly unconstitutional process, which is at the heart of this lawsuit. This raises the crucial question of whether the plaintiffs must go through the registration process and face potential denials by the ATF to establish their standing. Another significant issue is whether the Anti-Injunction Act bars the judge in this case from issuing an injunction or ruling that would prevent the enforcement of the NFA, which includes the tax requirements associated with suppressor registration. The AIA is a federal law that restricts lawsuits and court decisions that seek to restrain the assessment and collection of taxes. The ATF contends that the AIA prevents this lawsuit from proceeding and any judgment by the court that would challenge the tax requirement associated with suppressor registration. They argue that such a judgment would run counter to the concept behind the AIA, which aims to protect the federal government's ability to assess and collect taxes without being hindered by court actions. In contrast, Texas seeks to challenge the ATF's interpretation of the AIA and its application to this case. They argue that the AIA should not be used as a blanket defense to shield the ATF from judicial review of their suppressor regulations. Texas contends that the court has the authority to examine the constitutionality of the tax requirements under the NFA, especially in the context of the Second Amendment rights of individuals. The court's resolution of these complex legal questions will determine the future trajectory of the lawsuit and the standing of the plaintiffs. If the court rules in favor of Texas, it could open the door for further scrutiny of the ATF's suppressor regulations and potentially lead to significant changes in how suppressors are regulated under the NFA. Second Amendment and suppressors. The heart of this legal argument revolves around Texas's assertion that the Anti-Injunction Act does not apply to this case. The AIA restricts lawsuits and court decisions that attempt to restrain the assessment and collection of taxes. However, Texas argues that the lawsuit's primary objective is to enjoin the enforcement of various statutes, regulations, and duties imposed by the ATF, which go beyond challenging the taxation aspect. Texas contends that the AIA is not relevant in this case because they seek to halt the enforcement of suppressor-related regulations, such as application requirements, registration, and serialization mandates. These regulations extend beyond the taxation component, and Texas maintains that the AIA should not shield the ATF from judicial review in this matter. The letter submitted by Texas also addresses a pivotal and controversial question: whether suppressors are protected under the Second Amendment. Texas argues that the focus should be on the Second Amendment's protection of conduct rather than specific devices. They contend that the question of whether a firearm suppressor qualifies as an arm is not the central issue after the Supreme Court's ruling in the case of Bruin. According to Texas, the Second Amendment safeguards the conduct of using arms for self-defense, and this protection should extend to suppressors as well. By emphasizing the broader notion of conduct, Texas attempts to assert that the Second Amendment's scope goes beyond merely protecting conventional firearms. They contend that suppressors, as self-defense tools, are inherently related to the conduct protected by the Second Amendment. The court's consideration of this question will have profound implications for the regulation and classification of suppressors. A ruling in favor of Texas could pave the way for expanding the scope of Second Amendment protection to include suppressors, potentially changing the landscape of suppressor regulations in the U.S. However, it is essential to acknowledge that the interpretation of the Second Amendment is a contentious and evolving issue. The court's decision will likely draw from historical context, legal precedents, and societal considerations in determining the extent of Second Amendment protection afforded to suppressors. Arms and suppressor rights. In the thrilling aftermath of the Bruin decision, the court's broad definition of arms sent shockwaves through the legal battleground. With the court recognizing the historical inclusion of defense armor in the arms category, it became evident that the definition encompassed more than just completed weapons. As a modern instrument facilitating armed self-defense, a firearm suppressor neatly fit within the court's latest interpretation in Bruin. In a stunning twist, the court allowed the state of Texas to present additional arguments to bolster their case, addressing the pivotal questions raised during the hearing. This cleanup letter offered Texas a golden opportunity to provide further support for their motion for summary judgment. This thrilling development keeps the suspense high as the case teeters on the edge, awaiting a decisive resolution. Amidst the uncertainty, this letter is a ray of hope for the pro-Second Amendment side. Despite earlier speculations that the hearing did not bode well for them, the court's willingness to entertain additional arguments ignites a glimmer of optimism. Texas seizes this chance to fortify their position and make a compelling case for the grant of summary judgment in their favor. As the legal saga unfolds, the clash between the court's modern interpretation of arms and the constitutional protection of suppressors reverberates through the halls of justice. The fate of suppressor regulations and Second Amendment rights hangs in the balance, and with the court's receptiveness to Texas's plea for further support, the stakes are higher than ever before. Will Texas's additional arguments tip the scales in their favor, ushering in a new era of Second Amendment protection for suppressors? Or will the court's scrutiny dampen their hopes, leaving them grappling with unanswered questions? Only time will tell as this gripping legal drama unfolds, pitting the fundamental right to self-defense against the regulatory landscape of firearm suppressors. Supreme Court triumph. In a historic victory for gun owners, the Supreme Court has delivered a resounding endorsement of the Second Amendment by backing the suppressor freedom law and striking down NFA regulations on suppressors. The long-awaited ruling represents a major milestone in the ongoing debate over firearm rights and regulations in the United States. The suppressor freedom law, which aimed to remove NFA restrictions on suppressors, has been a subject of intense scrutiny and legal battles. Gun rights advocates argued that suppressors, also known as silencers, are vital tools for protecting hearing and enhancing shooting safety, and their regulation under the NFA was an infringement on the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court's ruling marks a decisive turning point, affirming that the right to bear arms extends to suppressors and that their possession and use should not be subjected to stringent federal regulations. This groundbreaking decision not only upholds the individual's right to self-defense, but also recognizes the practical utility and safety benefits of suppressors in firearms. For gun owners, this victory is a vindication of their constitutional rights and a signal of the court's commitment to protecting Second Amendment freedoms. On the other hand, critics argue that the ruling may lead to increased gun violence and compromise public safety, reigniting debates over the balance between individual liberties and public security. As the nation grapples with the implications of this landmark ruling, the future of firearm regulations and Second Amendment protections remains a topic of intense debate and will likely continue to be a significant issue in the national discourse. That's all for this video, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.